All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Introduction to Bonds. What an exciting way to start your week at TAP. It's going to be a fantastic way to kick off the conference. And we have a really great group of panelists today that are going to kind of walk us through the basics. We're going to talk about bonds in Texas. What are bonds? Why do we need them? And then we're going to move into some of the structures that we're using today in the current market. I'll go down the list and let folks introduce themselves. To start off, I'm Allison King. I'm a partner with Tiber Hudson Law Firm. And most of our team is focused based in the DC area, but our role is focused in Underwriters Council and Bond Purchasers Council. I'm based in Charleston, South Carolina, but Texas is my #1 state for business. So we're doing things across the country. We're closing around 300 bond transactions a year. And we do offer free bond training. So if that's interesting to you, please reach out to me after the presentation and we can schedule something. I'll pass it over to Cricket to introduce herself.
Morning, y'all. Cricket Cleary. I'm a director of development at Lincoln Avenue Communities. We're a developer with around 30,000 units across 29 states, one of which is Texas.
Great. And Braxton Parsons, I'm with Hilltop Securities. I was a last minute add to the panel. So be kind, please. These are not my slides I'll be going through, but I'm a previous employee at the Bond Review Board. So hopefully I can fake my way through the PAB program for y'all.
Well, and they updated your name tag. So this is actually,
that is me.
Actually you.
I'm Jack Leonard. Despite what it says in the slides, I work for Bricadia. I might as well work for Lincoln Avenue because we do so much business together. But I'm on the debt side and cover vast array or the wide spectrum of affordable housing finance, both preservation and tax and bonds and all of that. So happy to be here.
And I'm Levi Stone King. I am a lawyer at Bracewell. I serve as bond counsel for issuers all over the state, but some of our bigger clients are in San Antonio and also in Houston.
Okay, so we will be monitoring the WOVA app. I mean, this app is amazing, right? We're all getting all these messages. So if you have any questions, feel free to send it via the app, or you could just do the old-fashioned, like raise your hand. We're happy to interact in person. So we will be saving some time at the end for questions, but feel free to jump in throughout the presentation if something comes up.
Right.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, yeah. So looks like we're going to talk about the private activity bonds to kind of start out, which, I mean, as most of you know, that is kind of your access to tax credits for housing. I think what really a lot of people kind of forget when we're in the housing world, we're very kind of niche in that, is there's so many other uses for the PAT program. Mainly you go through, like I said, housing is a big driver in that. There's also low-income mortgages that's typically kind of run through by TSHAC, the Texas State Affordable Housing Corporation, and TDHCA, the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. Also kind of small industry bonds. Those really haven't got a lot of usage lately over probably the last 4 or 5 years. They're kind of limited to $10 million each. So that's something that's not heavily utilized, but also starting to kind of pick up the past couple of years has been student loans. There's kind of private corporations that issue student loans, as well as there's the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board that issues through the state voted subceiling. And then as well as kind of under subceiling 5, there's a water disposal facility. So there's a lot of other uses out there than just housing, though I'll say probably 90% of the PAB really ends up falling into affordable housing with multifamily.
I think something that's really interesting is that every state has the autonomy to allocate that private activity volume cap towards multifamily. So some states prioritize it much more than others. Some states, it's only like 15% that's going to affordable housing versus other uses like roads and wastewater. But affordable housing is the only use that comes with that additional subsidy of the tax credit. So it is a powerful tool.
It is. And I guess, like Allison said, each state kind of has their own rules for allocating volume cap out. Texas runs theirs under Chapter 1372 of the Texas Government Code. And it's a very long and frustrating government code that not many people know. George does, though, in the back there. He's a pro. There we go. Not sure where to point this thing yet. Sorry. Kind of one of the advantages of using the Privativity Bond Program is you're getting a lower interest rate on the tax exempt portion of the debt compared to a taxable portion. And I guess this isn't really an advantage for y'all since you are mostly developers, but for the governmental entities, it really moves that risk from a governmental entity like the HFC or the PFC that's required to issue those bonds onto the private developer, because these are kind of private public partnerships through the issuance of debt. This also kind of projects an opportunity to compete with projects based on the positive benefits of the community. I'm not sure what exactly that means from the bond review board, but essentially you have to have some type of public benefits in each of these kind of projects, whether they're housing or the water projects or other kinds of uses. They have to have some type of public use to be able to allocate productivity bond funds to them. It's also, like I said, allows you to secure tax exempt financing to help fund these capital expenditures. Oh, what's this slide here? I haven't really reviewed these slides too much, guys. Sorry. See, private investments and infrastructure is incentivized. So it's kind of incentivizes you to put in more kind of private funds into these. There's a lot of gap financing that's coming in now. So you're having to kind of find other tranches. I think, Levi, we're going to get into the 25% test kind of change soon, which that's going to very much open up other kind of funding sources for a lot of these projects for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And something else I would note here that's relevant to this slide is that, and it's kind of worth remembering, and is that these bonds are not actually the debt of the governmental entity that issues them. So we're talking about public-private partnerships, but at the end of the day, the government isn't going to have to increase their own debt obligations or raise taxes in order to support these bonds. And so it's when you're talking to communities and to elected officials about your projects, that's something that you'll want to highlight, right? Because people don't always understand that.
Yeah, most of the deals I think that we all work on together are going to be conduit deals, right? So that responsibility is passed directly through the issuer to the borrower. So the borrower, as you mentioned, is on the hook for repayment of the debt.
Right, especially for the PAB bonds or Privativity bonds. I mean, they have those kind of essential function bonds that a couple HFCs and PFCs have done where they're the 100% owner, and those are not subject to volume cap. So that's kind of a different beast in its own.
That's bonds
They also
102.
are impaired with credits too. Right.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
They're impaired with essential function bond, non-private activity would be paired with 4%
Yeah,
credits.
exactly.
Right. So
Exactly.
you are 100% bond finance essentially for those type of transactions. It's a little more risky. That's why there hasn't been a lot done in the state, especially recently with interest rates.
Yeah.
And then this slide, it's a little misleading. I had to put this slide together when I was at the bond review board. It's a little misleading just because you look at this and you think there's so much volume cap available. What this is showing is it's showing all of the volume cap between the 2024 year, which was the last full program year, as of November 14th or November 15th, 2024. So current year 24 volume cap plus all carry forward those available at that time. So it's a little misleading when you look at this. You're thinking that there's $6.6 billion available for me to make an application with, and as I kind of stated, and Allison kind of stated earlier, there's different tranches of this PAB program, which it shows here for single family housing, the state voted issues, and then multifamily housing is what really everyone here is looking for, is multifamily housing, and that is also kind of further divided out into set asides for TSHAC and TDHCA, and then HFCs under subceiling 4. So it's a big aggregate number here, but when you really kind of get into the breakdown of that, when you look at kind of current year, there's only for HFC specifically in that subceiling, there's about $750 million available of current year volume cap to make applications to HFCs. TSHAC gets about $100 million this past year, and then TDHCA received about $213 million. So we try to make this as even as we can for each kind of agency and state corporation and then the housing finance corporations to kind of move forward with their own projects. We further divide out the housing finance corporations into regions. We have 13 sub-regions across the state. And we then further divide out that $750 million into these 13 individual regions, which are kind of based on population. And then you have a heavy, of course, application period during the lottery for those heavier regions, like Region 3, which is Dallas, of course, Region 7, which is the Austin area, Region 6 is Houston. So those have ample applications, sometimes 10, 15 applications that are competing for each other, and there's obviously not enough volume cap to go around for those individual regions. That's when you kind of get into the lottery period that I just kind of briefly mentioned, which is a actual lottery. The Bond Review Board has a retired Cash 5 machine that they used. We went and picked that up from the state surplus when I was still at the agency. It was quite fun to play with on Fridays. We had to kind of keep it lubricated and make sure that it was still up and running. So we play fake bingo games almost is what I would do with it, goofing around.
Who gets to leave early on a Friday? You
Yeah.
pull up their ball.
But that is a kind of weird part of the Texas program is it's part of it is random. So we have randomness in the program. There's also kind of scoring within the priorities that you get into, and those priorities are, I mean, generally, I'm not going to get into too deep on that, but generally, it's the more affordable that you are with your project, the higher priority that you're getting. So just more set asides for 30% units or 60% and 50% units you do in your project or development, you have a better chance of getting a earlier reservation, we'll say. And then this is really so we briefly, Eli, we've kind of touched on the 25% test. This is the one place in statute in which it does tie the 51% bond financing to the PAB program. I think it's a little up to interpretation. I see everybody's kind of reading through this really quick. So it's essentially, it's stating that if you make application through the Bond Review Board and you show it you are a priority 1 or priority 2 on the residential rental form, then you must submit an application to TDHCA if you are using at least 51% of tax-exempt private-activity bonds. So, I mean, my interpretation would be if you make application and you're assuming 30%, then you wouldn't really need to make application to TDHCA prior to receiving a reservation. I don't know if you've seen here.
But no, yeah, I have it in front of me here. This is an interesting rule, and it's one that I think folks forget about and that hasn't come up. I mean, my personal read of it is that it functions very similar to the 50% test or now 25% test that we talk about at the federal level, which is to say that if you have a project that has been assigned one of these higher priorities, that you must issue at least 51% of bonds, 51% of your eligible basis in bonds. I think that's probably, this might be getting also into a sort of 102 kind of topic that,
right.
we could talk about at a different time. But I think, everybody hears about the 50% test. We're going to talk to you in a minute about how that is now generally the 25% test. But I think be aware that there are also state level rules that you also need to comply with, not just rules that are contained in the federal tax code.
Agreed. I mean, it is, like I said, wildly complicated through the state, wildly complicated federally as well. So that's why you have good counsels like Levi and Allison working on your transactions. And then it looks like this gets into, we had a huge bill for the private activity bond program. It was the 86th session. That was 2019, I believe. I was still at the state for that session. And these are just some of the larger changes that kind of came through that big bill, that big, beautiful bill of Texas. So we ended up reallocating a lot of authority for Section 4, which means we eliminated a total subceiling. Student loan bonds always had their own subceiling. It was subceiling 5. They were not being used at that time at all. There was other kind of issues within 1372 and other government codes that wouldn't allow them to issue student loan bonds. So we essentially eliminated that entire subceiling and moved them into subceiling 6, which is kind of the all other subceiling, the catch-all that it covers PFCs and water projects and now student loan bonds. It made that the new subceiling 5. By eliminating that volume cap for the old subceiling 5, we moved that over to subceiling 4 for more multifamily housing, subceiling 1 for TDHCA and TSHAC and others to issue mortgage revenue bonds, and just kind of tried to be kind of evenly dispersed for the remaining subceilings. We also raised under Section 13 of that bill the total amount of bond allocation available. I think that's on the next slide, so I'll hold up to get too deep into that. And then we also extended the time to close. Used to, for housing bonds, you had 150 days, which that's 5 months. It's quick. You now have 180 days. Not a lot more time, but it has been very helpful, especially with there's current delays going through with agencies like Freddie and HUD. It's been very.
You're still not taking a nap.
No, what?
You got to move to closing.
Absolutely not. I mean, really for the best advice I'll give every developer out here is move as quick as you can. If you know you're getting a reservation upcoming, get on the phone with your equity providers, because that's always the drag on a deal, is trying to find your equity, ensure that they're locked up and that you're comfortable with the rates that you're getting from your equity provider. So don't wait until month 3 of month 6 to lock in equity, because that it puts a lot of stress on everyone else and yourselves on that
Well, and from
transaction.
the lender's perspective as well, too, I'm sure you're working these deals well before they get their allocation. So
And it's a spectrum too. Like HUD's
Yeah.
the longest lead time, and
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that they've been like a significant player in the new construction space. But I mean, if you know you're going to get a reservation, the HUD's your route. Like you should be working on the loan well before you even apply.
Yeah.
And then yeah, I mean to your point, I mean Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have had elongated timelines, so that's certainly been
Yeah.
somewhat of a bottleneck in
Yeah.
terms of executing.
And then this is the new kind of limits that were created by the 2019 bill. The main one is for housing. The old limit was $20 million. So I mean, nowadays, and even in 2018, 2019, there was not a lot of transactions getting done for $20 million. The way the program would work then, it still does, is any limits on the application amount is removed on August 15th when we do a larger kind of collapse of the entire program to go into one giant pool. And in the olden days, there would be a line out the door of the bond review board into the breezeway at 4 PM on August the 14th. I would roll in around 6 AM and let everybody in the building. There would be sometimes 30 people waiting in line, and large developers, state agencies too. I mean, the former director of bond finance at TDHCA would wait in line overnight to ensure that her projects were essentially funded. So it was a wild time. The last couple of years, it became a bit of a party. People would bring ice chests. Summer, were you there? I think you were. No, you didn't make it. But those days are gone since we have increased the limits. I think everyone's really able to get their projects done and developments done earlier in the program year. So we're seeing a much more early demand, which is what kind of leads us into here right after. This is the amount of applications that have been coming through against the total reservation. So prior to the application limit change, in 2015, 16, 17, we didn't have a lottery. We barely had one in 2018, and then we have one application that was a lottery application in 2019. So no need to
Just
hold a lottery.
one ball in the machine.
No one sad ball. We knew that one was going to be first. That was the downside of the Cash 5 machine, is when there is one ball left, it does rattle, or 2 balls, they rattle around. But as you can see, I mean, there is a lot of demand through the program. I mean, typically the VRB is able to kind of get through over 100 reservations annually, and that's really due to just volume cap turnover. Like I said, you have 6 months to get these projects done, and there can be delays with getting equity, just getting overall financing through HUD or Freddie. There's also permitting issues. If you wait on your entitlements, that can take a long time too. And those, again, you have 6 months as a hard deadline. There's no extensions. There's no do-overs until you actually just pull that application or that reservation and you start over, in which you have to wait all in line again, and it can take some time. I'll say back in 2015, 16, 17, those were the good old days where you could pull an application, there would be volume cap available. You would just immediately get a reservation. I think what we can see here is, like I said, we're having more larger projects kind of come through. So you're getting a lot more applications in that lottery period, and they're really kind of doing a lot more competing with their priority levels and with the actual lottery itself. And this is a fun slide. I think I actually put this one together first, probably 6 or 7 years ago. This is the general timeline of the program. So this just shows, I guess, really from the state side, and when they're accepting applications, for everyone in this room, it starts a little bit earlier, right, Levi? And we got to get induced by a governmental entity.
Absolutely, yeah. If you hadn't mentioned it, I was going to. So for the developers in the room, this timeline needs to start probably 2 or 3 months before what is shown here.
I don't want to say now.
Yeah, I would say every year, the last several years, we have had folks come to us wanting to submit an application into the lottery, and they're talking to us on October 15th, and the lottery deadline is in 5 days. So it's not impossible. It's not possible at that point to get a public meeting and pass an inducement resolution, which is needed as one of the items to submit your bond review board application. So, absolutely be out there finding an issuer and getting induced in the summertime, so that when the lottery time comes around, you're ready to submit that lottery application.
It's And then I guess the overall kind of schedule here. I mean, once you are induced, I mean, that's when the bond council can put together the application. We're starting to kind of get moving with the bond review board. You have roughly 15 days for that lottery application period. And then typically it's generally it's been the first Thursday in November they've held the lottery, which they do stream that live. You can watch it all live, or you can go down there like I do. I think I was the only person in there in the room last year, so it was nice. They had cookies and donuts for everybody, and one person showed up. But it's a fun experience just to kind of watch the randomness of the lottery, and then you kind of go through. I guess at that point you know the order of the applications. You don't quite know the volume cap amount available yet, since everything is based on population. We have to. They're the bond review. I just keep saying we. I don't work there anymore. The bond review board has to wait for the Census Bureau to release population estimates. And that's typically mid-December-ish to late December. So I know when I was at the bond review board, there was a lot of phone calls. Well, when are we going to know the volume cap? How much is going to be out? What I do now is I just generally increase it by 2% from last year, just to be conservative. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's a little less, but that's just a general rule for me is I just increase it by 2% and then kind of divide that out through the different kind of subceilings and regions. But at least you, at that point, if you are in probably the first kind of 3 or 4 applications in a region through an HFC, you know you're going to get a reservation. And at that point, you need to start kind of thinking about your project and start moving forward with it. Everything then, program year starts January 2nd. That's when everyone gets funded through their PAB funds. And hopefully we're starting to move forward. Then March 1st is where we have the local regional collapse. All those regions that I spoke about go into one pool just for the HFCs at that point. We then kind of go into the June 1st priority boost, which is fun. That is if you apply as a priority 1D, which is if your census tract of your property has an AMI that's lower than the state's AMI, then you get a priority 1D boost, right? Okay. Well, my memory here, Summer. So you get a priority 1D boost. So you jump in line up to the front in front of every other priority 3 or priority 2 that is in the application. When we have August 7th is the single family collapse that's coming up in a few weeks. Really, that is anything that's left over in subceiling 1 that's dedicated to mortgage revenue bonds that collapses into one pool. And then it's because that is also divided out for TSHAC and TDHCA and the HFCs. Generally, what's happened is it's been split between TDHCA and TSHAC. The last couple of years, I know TDHCA has started doing kind of single family assignments with different HFCs to get more volume cap. So it's been more competitive between TSHAC and TDHCA. It used to be a gentleman's agreement of we'll split it 50-50. Now it's who gets in there first, which I understand. I mean, they both use a lot of volume cap for both of their programs. Once we get into August 15th, that's the fund collapse where everything that's left over in the subceilings goes into just one giant pool for all applications. Typically, this is where you see a rush of reservations for any remaining multifamily projects. It's usually just a couple subceilings, usually, subceiling 2 that's left over for the state voted issues. It's going to be about 300 million this year. It's going to go into this collapse. And then the smaller issuance IDBs, those are around 80 million that's going to go into a collapse. That's 380. And then any kind of smaller change that's left over between the set asides for TSHAC and TDHCA and the HFCs and subceiling 5. That's usually kind of it's really just what's not enough to make a full reservation. So it'd usually be $5 to $10 million for each of those subceilings. So conservatively, I would say around 390 to 400 million should come available at the August collapse, which right now we have about there's 600 million in line or 700 million in line right now between the 2 subceilings, which there might be a few withdrawals pending. So it's going to be a pretty funded collapse this year. So if you have any applications, I might suggest getting in line. You have a good chance of getting reserved before the end of the program year, which is next on the chart at November 15th.
Yeah, and I think I would just add, obviously, I think the last 2 years we've seen that every application in the lottery does get a bite at the apple. And so what that's doing is effectively when you're signing up your PSA in the summertime, making sure you have time to get your inducement, you're really having to elongate those purchase agreement timelines. So we're seeing 12 to 18 months to make sure that when your time comes, you have the bandwidth in your purchase agreement to get the deal closed.
And I'll say as of right now, all lottery applications have been reserved. Like at this point in the program year, we're reserving either new applications that were not part of the lottery or reapplications that refuse their reservation because they didn't realize, oh, we don't have entitlements. We need to pull our reservation early. And these are reapplications that are being reserved now. So we've already gone through the 120 lottery applications that were received this year. This gets into kind of that priority 1D and the reordered lottery shift. Again, this is for if you have a 1D application, you kind of boost it up, and then there is just a slight explanation of the August 15th collapse, which again is just any leftover amounts in the subceilings goes into one giant pool. And then just another kind of explanation here. I've already kind of gone through. I'm going off slides because I didn't make this presentation, but I've already kind of got into just the priority kind of descriptions for just the different kind of levels of priority 1A, B, and C that you can apply with. And then again, on June 1st, you do get that boost up from a priority 1D.
And the slides will be available for folks to review. I mean, obviously, this is Bonds 101. This is a lot of information, and Texas is a very special state for nuances and that type of thing. So understanding this is not, you're not going to walk away from this panel, even though Braxton's doing an amazing job presenting the information. You're not going to understand it on day one. So it does take a lot of research and practice.
Looks like we have an overview of the latest bill that came through last legislative session, the 88th, not this one that just ended this spring, but the one previously 2 years ago. This was the change that ended up kind of capping your amount of tax-exempt bond amount. So if the program is oversubscribed during the lottery program, which is a very kind of fuzzy definition of oversubscribed, but it typically is, you're limited to a 55% basis on the upper end of your bond amount. In this previously, before the 25% reduction, that you had a 5% window to find that sweet spot. What it ended up kind of doing for the next program year, a couple of years after for that project, is if costs went up and you were under that 50% threshold, you were given a priority 0 to kind of come in, and hopefully you would be first in line to get a supplemental issuance, so you would then be able to meet your 50% test. I think there's going to be some thinking going on at the state this next session, just to how that's going to kind of impact with the new reduction in the basis requirements. And then this really just kind of getting into just the rules for that priority 0. Just the application periods are a little weird. We had some projects this past year that were old. I mean, they were 6-7 years old when they made their applications, and they were looking to make in a priority 0 request. The rules do say you have to have a 4-year period of your TDHC application and your bond closing in order to qualify for a priority 0. So if you closed in 2018, for example, you're outside of that 4-year window. So this has actually come up very quickly. I was rather surprised that we had developers that were looking for additional funds, that long after closing. But it did kind of surprise everybody this first program year that we used the new priority 0. And then this is looks like a screenshot of the Bond Review Board webpage. So all this information for the PAB spreadsheet, that's really the only outward facing information for everybody. It's located at the arrow there under the 2025 program year. And it is a 20 tab spreadsheet that is not, I mean, it's the best you can do to kind of track all of this, just because there's so many, again, regions and subceilings. It's difficult to put that in a digestible form. And the Excel spreadsheet was really what's been used for the last 20 years at least. And they do go back. They have the history if you want to go back and see what the PAB program looked like in 2018, just how slow it was and how reservations just kind of slowly moved. It's good history that they do keep there at the Bond Review Board. And you can also see that the lotteries, surplus in the 2006, 2007. There was like 400 or 500 applications in those lotteries. It was a crazy, crazy time. But I think that is finally through the Texas Private Activity Bond Program.
Great job. So I'm sure everyone now is an expert in Texas bonds. So we're going to pass it over to Levi to walk us through. So now we understand bonds a bit. Why do we need bonds, and what's the purpose of them in these projects? So, but before we move into that, we do have a couple of questions from the app. How do bonds function as a financing tool for affordable housing in Texas? And what factors most influence their success or limitations in today's market? So I think one thing we talked about was volume cap limitation. So, as far as functioning as a tool in Texas, it's under the federal program, it unlocks the 4% credit. So I think this question is going to be answered by Levi's presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. So So we gave some reference to the 50% test before, but I'll dive into it a little bit more now. So historically, in order to access the 4% low income housing tax credits, one would have to finance at least 50% of their eligible basis with tax exempt bonds. And so whether or not the interest rate was preferable on that tax exempt product, you would still need to get tax exempt bonds in order to use the 4% low income housing tax credits. However, the big beautiful bill has changed some things with that. So the requirement is now 25%. That is for bond issuances starting on January 1st, 2026 going forward. So for projects that you're working on now that are going to close before the end of the year, you've still got to comply with the 50% test. But it's going to become the 25% test, which in theory, because there's a federal limit on how much volume cap each state has, in theory, this will double or could double up to double the amount of projects that could be done in under any given state's cap. But as we said before, in Texas, we also have that little wrinkle of the 51% test for certain projects. So all that to say, every situation is a little bit different, and make sure you're speaking with your issuer and bond counsel about what specific requirements you're going to need to satisfy in your project. But the question I think was, what's the role of the bond financing, but also what makes it successful? And I would say from bond counsel's perspective, I think what makes it successful is a developer who's organized, and who has advisors that are helping them spot issues and fill their gaps and, take care of a lot of things that really have nothing to do with the bonds, but can ultimately sink the project. We can't close on the bonds if we don't have a project that's viable. And so, I think getting an early start is also very important. Notwithstanding that we have this 180-day deadline, there has been a trend in recent years to trying to close deals in 12 or maybe even 8 weeks. And that's just really, really tough. And so sometimes you run out of time. An 8-week closing timeline leaves room for absolutely nothing to go wrong. So, getting an early start, staying organized, I think those are really, it seems simple, but it's worth saying out loud. Those are really important to having success.
I think there are a lot of considerations too with this reduction of the 50% test, right? Like equity pricing potentially going down, right? And then the bandwidth of issuers, third-party reports, all of these types of things, which are already, you're on this very tight time frame of getting these third-party reports in for closing. If you're essentially doubling the volume of deals, are these environmental engineers and surveyors and things going to be able to get things done in time for closing, as well as just how fees are calculated, right? Like issuers often, their fee is based off of the bond par amount. So if the bond par amount is going down, how are they going to effectively double the volume of deals at the same fee? Like that's a little bit much to ask, right? So
I think also, a project costs $100 million to do, whether basis is 50 or 25%. You got to find that other funding source. And taxable bonds have a higher rate. Private loans will have a higher rate. It's certainly that's going to increase your carry costs. So we have to figure out just really how that's going to impact the projects overall and their funding sources. I'm worried about it a little bit.
Oh,
Jack.
I would, and Krika, you can weigh in on this too. I think that we're all concerned about the implications of that. And really, honestly, if it was just a function of, the debt side of the equation, like, higher blended cost of capital from tax exempt to taxable, we'd probably be fine. But the increase in the 25% test also is accompanied by a fixed 12% increase to 9% credit, the first in 25 years. And so, our equity group and other industry partners too are estimating that would add anywhere between $4 and $7 billion in additional LIHTC equity in the market, in a $26 billion market that's already starved for capital, right? So, I think that it will be interesting to see what that does to equity pricing. But I think like a year from now, we're probably looking at, a lot of projects that will have 7 handles instead of 8. So there's certainly a lot of challenges associated with the change in the rule. So
yeah, I think from our end right now, to take a conservative approach, we're basically knocking our credit pricing 10 cents.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's not what happens, but
yeah,
we'll see.
all right.
Okay. So there's a couple more informational slides here that you all can refer to.
Yeah, this was
later.
just kind of a heat map, as I mentioned earlier, that states have autonomy to allocate that private activity volume cap towards multifamily. So this gives a breakdown of which states are really prioritizing multifamily as part of their program. So you can see New York, California, Nevada are really strong states as far as prioritizing multifamily. But then other states are using that volume cap towards, roads, schools, water and sewer, that type of thing, single family. And this is some information that Tiber Hudson puts together with Novogradac every year, just kind of tracking that volume cap scarcity. And so this really kind of informs where that change in the 50% to 25% came from. When you're seeing that over 50% of our states are oversubscribed for bond volume cap, it's a really powerful message that something needed to change in the program. So, now that we have a 25% test, we'll see where that takes us.
Okay, so here I'm going to cover for you all some of the fundamental rules around tax exempt bonds, with the caveat that there are a lot more rules of like everything in the tax code. It's very complex. For me, it's like learning a foreign language, right? So it takes repeated exposure and practice before you really can develop a mastery. There's a joke I always tell to young law students or young lawyers, which is, why do they call it the practice of law? And the answer is because we're all just practicing, right? So, that's very true. That's very true with these with the tax code and with these rules around bonds. But there are some basic ones that you should know, and so we're going to go over those. And here is probably this slide represents kind of the most important one for us all, since we're here at an affordable housing conference, and these are the low income set asides that are required by the tax code. So you've got to satisfy either a 2050 test or a 4060 test, and that's so either 20% of your units have to be set aside for families that are earning 50% AMI or less, or 40% have to be set aside for families earning 60% AMI or less. The 4060 test is probably the more common metric that folks are looking to satisfy. But it's worth noting here that this is an income restriction and not a rent restriction, right? So your projects will have rent restrictions that come from other places, but the tax code itself just contains this requirement for the low income set asides.
I think something that was interesting to me as I was learning all the ins and outs of the code, the bond rules are not the exact same as the tax credit rules. And so kind of having an understanding of those as they work together, they mirror each other, but they're not exactly the same. So that income restriction versus rent restriction is something you'll come in contact with on the tax credit side.
And the tax credits, the tax credit regulations are far more restrictive, right, than the bonds.
And so the AMI, in case you didn't know, is set annually by HUD, and you can find that information on HUD's website. I have it bookmarked on my computer, but pro tip, you can also Google HUD AMI lookup and get exactly where you need to go if you're trying to find that information quickly. The tenant incomes need to be certified also on an annual basis, and so that's to say that a tenant doesn't have to move out once their income increases. But once it gets above 140% of the area median income, the next available unit in your project, you have to hold it aside for a low income tenant. So that's how that works. When hopefully people's incomes go up, you can still stay compliant with these rules. The qualified project period. So this is an important aspect of the rules. So this is the time period during which a property has to serve low income tenants. And again, it's a minimum that's imposed by the tax code. You might have a much longer affordability period. Different sources of financing that you might bring in could have other requirements attached to them. But the qualified project period is approximately 15 years. It starts when 10% of your project is occupied. And that requirement is tied to the tax exemption on the bonds, but also be aware that the affordability for LIHTC projects is going to be longer, as we've discussed. There's some more restrictive rules. So in general, the affordability period for your low income housing tax credit project is going to be 30 years. And So that additional 15 years is referred to as the extended use period. And be aware that there are pretty steep penalties for failure to comply with this, right? So you could wind up having your bonds be taxable, you could lose your tax credits, and then there could be any number of defaults under all of your other documents that you've executed for your project. And so compliance is a very important piece of this puzzle. Up here at once. Okay, so in addition to the affordability requirements, there are some rules about how you can use your bond proceeds. An important one is the 95-5 test. That's to say that 95% of your bond proceeds have to be spent on what are called good costs. And so generally, those are going to be the capital costs of your project: land and building acquisition, hard costs of construction. You aren't sure if something is a good cost or a bad cost, ask an accountant or a tax lawyer. We have a lot of discussions about these things. Bad costs are things like your cost of issuance, legal fees, costs for preparing your tax credit application, funding of operating reserves. And so at the outset, you need to keep an eye on what all of your bond proceeds are being used.
And on most projects, we try to not spend the bonds on bad costs at all and use some other source of funding to cover those bad costs.
Right, exactly. So for example, tax credit equity can cover some of these bad costs because at the end of the day, and this is referenced on the slide, only 2% of your, you're allowed to use 2% of your proceeds on cost of issuance, but cost of issuance are almost certainly going to exceed 2%. And so you have to find another source for those funds.
And I would, practically speaking, these rules don't often become real issues, but I think, again, with the 180-day closing timeline, making sure that you're talking to your bond counsel early, you're having these conversations, and everybody's looking at it the same way, I think is really important. To your point of having an organized closing, just making sure you're on the same page.
And accountants too. Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. Bond counsel or their tax counsel should have a diligence questionnaire to send out to you all. They can help guide you, provided that you respond to the diligence questionnaire. So again, stay organized and follow the instructions of the folks that are really trying to help you out with this. And then finally, there's a limit, 25% for acquisition. Okay, and now there's a limitation on the maturity of your bonds. So you'll hear a term of art that is WAM, which is weighted average maturity. And the weighted average maturity of your bonds can't exceed 120% of the expected economic life of your project. So the way that is calculated, by the way, is that you have to look at the estimated useful life of each component of your project. You have to calculate how much bond financing is allocated to each of those components, and then weight the average useful lives with respect to the percentage of your financing that's allocated to those components. So that'll allow you to come up with what the weighted average maturity.
WAM sounds more exciting than it is.
Yeah, I know, right? And it's, this is one of those rules that could seem, somewhat arbitrary, but there's a policy behind it. And for me, it's always helpful to try to understand, like, what is the rule trying to solve for? And it helps you remember it. And so, at the end of the day, what the service is trying to do here is to prohibit granting a tax exemption on a finance project, a financial product that is no longer actually providing any benefit, right? So if the maturity of the bonds is super long and that exemption is extending throughout that entire period of time, but the project was long built and destroyed before all of that happens, it's sort of an inefficient use of the tax resources. So that's the reason for that. And then additionally, where you use bond proceeds for an acquisition, you have to spend 15% on rehab, but the source of the rehab doesn't have to be bond proceeds, but you do have to spend 15% of that amount on rehabilitation. Here we're talking about the inducement resolution. So there are, the inducement resolution comes up in a number of places. So we talked about how one needs an inducement resolution in order to submit an application for private activity bonds. But the date of that inducement resolution is also very important for developers because it fixes a point in time beyond which you cannot get reimbursed for any pre-development expenses that you have. So, Cricket, do you have anything to add from a developer's perspective? I thought you said you wanted to.
No, I think again, just making sure you're aware of that. That obviously is really important as you're racking up pre-development costs and making sure that you're getting that in early if you can. And I think also noting if you do end up changing issuers at any point, if you apply and don't close and end up having to go with a different issuer, you do need to get reinduced. So an important thing. Not common, but important to watch out for.
Yeah, absolutely important to watch out for. And so I think this is one of those things where, you may not remember exactly what the rules are, but if you have a situation where you have an inducement resolution and then you have to reinduce a project, it should trigger something in your mind to ask a question, right? Like to remember that there could be an issue that you need to follow up on.
Maybe another click through all the way.
There we go.
I'll chime in with a question that we got through the app. Let's see. Essentially, the question is wanting to have a better understanding of the role of public bonds in supporting affordable housing and what myths or concerns that often arise. I think kind of we've already covered that the role of public bonds in affordable housing is going to be a financing tool, but it also unlocks the 4% credits. One of the myths, I think, from my perspective, that arise might be the timing, and this is something that we'll talk about on this slide. The difference between a publicly offered deal and a private placement. I think we've already covered that to close a bond deal in Texas is such a tight time constraint. But the difference between a publicly offered deal and a private placement, there's a little bit of myth that surrounds a private placement being a faster execution. And I think really the bond timing falls in line with all of these other like third-party reports and things that are happening behind the scenes. And really kind of as we walk through this timing, the only distinction would be the posting of a preliminary official statement, the POS, which is another term of art, kind of funny, but posting the POS, pricing the bonds, and closing adds about another week and a half to 2 weeks. So, but sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no problem. So Braxton talked a little bit about timing before, but here's another kind of general timeline for a deal. And my heart would just be so happy if everybody had a 120-day closing timeline for their project. So, I mean, this kind of, the actual points along this timeline really could vary depending on the project, depending on the issuer, initial drafts of bond documents, depending on, how organized your bond counsel is and when they're ready to send those out. But as a general matter, it does really take this much time to do a deal correctly. What I would add to this timeline for Texas is also the Texas Attorney General's review process, right? So that is, as I understand, not something you have to deal with in other states, but we, in addition to everything else that we have to do, we also have to have the Attorney General's office approve our bond issuances. So that really comes at the very end of the timeline. 12 business days before the intended closing, a transcript must be submitted to the Attorney General's office. That has to be, we say, substantially complete copies of all of the core bond documents and certain other ancillary deliverables. And then 5 business days before your intended closing, you need to have a final bond submitted to the Attorney General's office. So if it's a publicly offered deal, you need to have priced by that 5 days before closing in order to have an interest rate so that you can submit a complete bond to the AG. And then 3 business days before closing, you need all of those documents that are part of that transcript. They need to be in final executed form. Final has air quotes around it. So small things can still change after that fact, and we can submit red lines to the Attorney General's office. We try not to do that because at that point, we really want them to just rubber stamp our file and issue their opinion. So the more red lines we give them, the more that they have to review before they can get that done. But it's very important that you have everything signed and delivered 3 business days before, and it is a rule that they are loath to waive. We have had to beg and plead before. We don't like to do that. You know, everybody in the working group just needs to be advised that they need to make sure their signatory is not on a yacht someplace and is available to sign, because those documents really do have to get.
That has come up.
Yeah.
But I think it's
I'm-
also important, Levi, to mention, I mean, it's not just the debt documents. I mean, it is the LPA as well. The partnership documents need to be submitted to the AG's office as well, because that is something that we always kind of have a hiccup with when we get that close to closing. Does that include the LPA?
Correct.
Yes, it does.
It does include the LPA, and you know, not to hate on any equity providers that are in the room, but that is the one that usually takes the longest, and the ones that we sometimes have to fight over the most. We're not kidding when we say we need a signed LPA 3 business days before closing.
I think Levi and I were chasing that down at TAP last year.
Yes. I believe
Yeah.
Allison and I had a phone call in which I used some colorful language about the equity provider. We actually did miss the deadline, and we were. I think we just nobody noticed, but it's really it can really blow up the deal. So be aware of that.
The key takeaway is it's never the lender's fault.
Don't stay off your yacht until you close the deal.
And then finally, this one to me is a little bit more of a bonds 102 concept, but I will note that there are a couple of issues that can come up where an equity provider is part of the same financial institution as the bond purchaser or the intended holder of the bonds. And that can have a variety of effects, right? I mean, it could be something where your tax exemption is not available because of that. There can also be some other rules that have to be navigated where perhaps an issuer's fee would need to be constrained as a result of this. And there are some issuers who won't want to do that and won't want to do your deal. That's not to say that you cannot have an equity provider that is part of the same financial institution as your bondholder, but it is an issue that needs to be explored and vetted by bond counsel, by tax counsel. If you are putting together a deal that way, make sure to let folks know early on that you are thinking of using, regions for both debt and equity, so that we can take a look at that and make sure that, the entities that will actually be participating in the deal are substantially remote enough that it doesn't cause any issues. We're usually able to navigate that if given a heads up about it.
Yeah, and I think this really kind of tees us off to our discussion. Now that we know about Texas bonds, why do we need bonds? We're going to move into some of the structuring techniques. And so the substantial user question is something that can really inform the types of executions that we choose. A publicly offered bond deal, for example, will solve for that substantial user issue in most cases. So let's pass it over to Jack to talk about some of the things that we're tracking. We're following the market every day. It's been a little more unpredictable this year, but obviously we're watching these numbers every day, and that really informs the type of execution that we're planning to use.
So I mean, and unlike Allison and Levi, I'm more concerned with how we actually fund the bonds, right? So there are basically 4 main avenues that you would take, in a private activity bond deal paired with low-income housing tax credits, either on the new construction side or for rehabilitation. That would be Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, private placement execution, which probably comprises about 12 or 13 different lenders in the market, and then the Department of Housing and Urban Development through the FHA. So those are basically the 4 main routes that you can take in terms of actually, placing the bonds and getting them funded. And the one index that we didn't put on the slide, and I know the text is really small, is probably 18-year SOFR swaps, which are the most, or SOFR swaps generally, probably are that's the most common index for private placement lenders. So you're looking, we look at 3 main market indicators. It would be treasuries, Freddie Mac and HUD are indexed off of 10-year treasuries. Fannie Mae through their MTEB program about 5 or 6 years ago, and correct me if I'm wrong, started indexing and trading in the municipal market. So they're indexed off of the MMD. And then private placement lenders, because they're primarily banks, the accepted index is SOFR swaps, because they're basically, indexing off of their cost of capital internally. But what I think is probably the biggest thing on this slide is you see, like, historically there's been quite a gap between treasuries and MMD. And that's really by virtue of the fact that the income on municipal bonds is tax exempt, right? And so in theory, the corporate tax rate's 21%. So treasuries should, in theory, be 21% higher than munis.
Yeah.
And so that, from a period, but, and you see in rare instances, the spread is super tight. And that was really just downward pressure from, prior to the Fed entering the hike cycle in 2022. That was putting downward pressure on treasuries, and, municipals kind of stayed, that's why that spread was so tight. And then the only other instance in this chart where munis and treasuries were, close to each other was in April of 2025, which everyone knows was when the new tariff regime was announced. That was a very rare and unique capital markets reaction. What else should we talk about?
Yeah, I would say kind of that spread is something it's an indicator of the cash collateral structure being a successful tool in today's market. So, and we'll get into more detail on that. But the idea being that you're able to, in Texas, one of the nuances is there's no drawdown bonds. So you're fully funding the bonds on day one. That cash is sitting with the trustee and can be reinvested in treasuries. So you're essentially taking the bonds out at that dark blue line, reinvesting them at the pale blue line. And depending on your execution, you may or may not be able to capture those positive earnings for the benefit of the deal. So
yeah, and I'd say that from, let's see what we have here, basically post hike cycle, when the spread between treasuries and munis was so wide that Fannie Mae benefited from that because they're obviously indexed off of municipals. But then also at the same time, about when you're talking about the cash collateralized structure, Fannie, the yield curve was inverted. So you were basically, there was no negative arbitrage at the time, and their rates were so much lower. So they were basically winning. It
was the year of the Fannie.
It was the year of the Fannie Mae, and they basically won so many deals that they had to pull back in credit because they just, from a portfolio balancing perspective, they had to become more conservative on credit. And then basically we're living in the reaction to that, kind of the yin and yang. I would say Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are the 800-pound gorillas. They are primarily the lenders in the space, and so Freddie basically reacted that by tightening their spreads. And so I think at this point in this historical chart, at the end, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are pretty much right on top of each other in terms of rate. And it's really just because Freddie has gotten more aggressive in trying to win back a lot of business they lost over the last 18 months. So
I think also for us visual learners here, I think this is a really helpful slide to see, as Braxton mentioned, with the 25% test, you're going to have more taxable debt in your deals, right? So looking at, roughly 50 bips for your taxable debt that you're now doubling in your deal as a result of the 25% test.
And I think overall cost of capital is probably going to increase, depending on the proportion of the deal that's financed with taxable debt, anywhere between 15 and 25% higher cost of capital than you did prior to that. So that's certainly a headwind for sure.
Let's go ahead and skip ahead to some of the case studies we can, or
Okay.
did you want to cover a little bit more? But
No, I think that covered it.
a little short on time.
Yeah, good.
Perfect. So wanted to run through just a quick private placement case study. I think this is a fun one because both Levi and Jack and his team at Berkadia worked on this deal. But Leon Creek Flats is a 308 unit family deal in San Antonio. We did close this deal almost 2 years ago. But so some of the numbers are a little outdated, but I do think relevant here. So we elected to work with the San Antonio Housing Trust as the issuer. We do find, with the 180-day shot clock and getting your resolution of no objection, a lot of times working with the local issuer just sort of streamlines a lot of those approvals at the local level. They often act as your GP and possibly your GC. So a lot of efficiencies there. So this deal was privately placed with Deutsche, serviced by Berkadia and originated by Berkadia. And I think relevant here. Oh, no. So sorry. I'm a boomer millennial. So this, sorry, back again. Oh. All right. Relevant here. So you'll see we have 3 tranches. Your Series A is going to be your tax exempt perm loan. And that that effectively transitions, converts from construction to your permanent loan. Your Series B is basically the bonds needed to meet your 50% test. So moving forward, this is effectively going to be eliminated most likely. We're probably going to see more taxable tails on your permanent loan with the 25% test. And then this Series C is a taxable construction loan effectively. And so I think also relevant here with we did reinvest the bonds during construction, and that was able to add an additional $2.5 million to the deal. Again, this is a 2023 deal, so different rates than today. But
because this was coming off the back of that, like, this was right at the beginning of the Fed tightening cycle. So for swaps, their relation to treasuries was super, super tight. And so, because private placements the executions typically associate lower transaction costs. That's what made it advantageous, I think, right?
Yep, exactly. I don't know, Levi, if you have any color to add.
Not necessarily. I would just reiterate what you said, that in this case, the issuer, in case folks didn't realize that issuers in Texas sometimes fulfill this role, but in this deal, the issuer also served as the fee owner of the land and ground lessor in order to help the project obtain a 100% ad valorem tax exemption, which I'm certain was an important feature for the economics of the deal. And here, this housing trust also served as the general contractor of the project. So they executed a master subcontract with the actual contractor who's going to build the project, but that allowed for a tax exemption on the building materials.
Yeah, the sales tax rebate,
which is a material item as well.
Okay, another flavor of execution is the short-term cash collateralized structure. And so this works well in a scenario, as Jack described, where currently we have tax exempt rates much lower than the taxable rates. The short-term cash collateral structure really sings when that taxable rate is less than the tax exempt rate. And so we had that scenario for many years. And that allows you to really take advantage of those favorable lending, parameters. And it works with FHA, it works with RD. You could do a taxable Fannie loan. We've also done these with just kind of soft dollars, like a CDBG, disaster relief funds coming in. So anyway, you're kind of marrying this taxable or these favorable loan conditions, but you still have to meet your 50% test. So you're having to layer in these bonds just for a short amount of time, and then they go away. So really only about 2 to 3 years until the project is placed in service. You've unlocked those credits, and then you're left with that favorable taxable loan. Just a little bit of a description about FHA. I don't know if you want to mention anything there, but
yeah, no, for sure. And like in my prediction, and this is just my opinion, is that I don't think that FHA has expressed much of an appetite to win more business in the private activity bond LIHTC space, but I think by virtue of the 25% test, more business will flow to them.
Absolutely, because
they've always been a taxable product, and especially considering that short-term cash collateralized structures aren't negative to the deal. Like you're earning more and reinvesting than you're paying to the bondholders during the 3 or 4 year period that you're building the project. So, and then, and there are a lot of, interesting features in an FHA deal. And I think the point number 2 is probably the most important. It's the only product in the space that has no resizing at conversion, which, especially I think people that were developing 3 years ago that are delivering into a market, especially like Austin, that's oversupplied, like that would have been a key feature. So and then there are some drawbacks. I think David's bacon wages is also a big headwind for them. But
and unfortunately they've had a lot of downsizing and everything with the current administration. So it's been a little bit more of a struggle to get a HUD deal closed.
I will tell you this though. You'd think that, but it depends what region of the country you're working for. So like I do a lot of my work in the Southeast, in the Jacksonville office, because for very, very, niche reasons, like the FHA, if you're doing an FHA insured loan, basically obligates the 10-year chain on a rehab. So we do a lot of our work, HUD work, by virtue of that specific niche execution. And the Southeast office is awesome. And then you'll go to the Northeast, right? Or like
Yeah.
somewhere else in the country, and it's just a completely different experience. So it's definitely region by region. But
And as I mentioned, again, we need the bonds to meet the 50% test. So I'll walk through. Unfortunately, TAP doesn't allow us to do animated slides. Some of you may have seen our Tiber Hudson animated slides, which we love. And I can send those to you after the presentation. But essentially what's happening under this structure is you're going to have the borrower is going to be closing on two loans at the day of closing. You're going to have the bonds and then that perm loan, so FHA or whatever execution you choose. Again, bonds have to be fully funded on day one. So it's going to be, those bonds are going to be sold through an underwriter publicly into the market and then fully funded with the trustee in exchange for the bond. So at all times, those bonds are going to be cash collateralized with those funds held in the trust estate. But remember, we have to spend those bond proceeds on the project to meet our 50% test, right? So rather than that FHA loan coming in and flowing directly to the borrower, those draws are going to flow to the trustee, who's then going to put that into the collateral account and then release a corresponding amount of bond proceeds to be spent on the project. And so that's going to continue through with each draw at all times, maintaining enough cash to fully collateralize the bonds and any interest owed on the bonds. And until all of those bond proceeds have been spent, the project is placed in service. So that's going to be 2 to 3 years, depending on how much work needs to be done. And then the bonds are going to go away and the project is left with that FHA or taxable Fannie or whatever execution at the end of the day. Again, as we talked about the cash collateralized structures being favorable in today's market, you have that cash that's sitting with the trustee for that 2 to 3 years, and you're able to invest that cash in that treasury rate, which is we're at like 65, 70 basis points spread.
I looked at this today. I mean, assuming a 36-month period, you're basically paying bondholders $315 and you're reinvesting at $387.
Okay. Yeah.
So I mean, it's pretty wide.
So in that example, the HUD loan was greater than the amount of the bonds. So that's the only source of collateral that you need. But in the case where that loan may be less than the amount of bonds, you're going to have to look to other sources of collateral. And so that could be soft funds. Direct equity cannot be used, but we can style it as a moment in time bridge, or we could do a true equity bridge on the project. It does have to meet a bankruptcy remote test to maintain AAA rating with the rating agency. But it's a very tried and true structure that's been used across the country for many years. So just kind of a couple of benefits to this short-term cashback structure. You're going to be looking at no long-term related fees. These bonds are only outstanding for 2 to 3 years. Depending on who your issuer is, this can be a big number or not. Some issuers charge, a lot for having those bonds outstanding. But again, if they're only outstanding for 2 to 3 years, that's cost savings. And then, a 266 election, we talked about having a great relationship with your accounting team. If you are doing a cash collateralized structure, making sure you're having that conversation with your accountant about taking a 266 election will allow you to take that bond interest and also your construction interest in your basis calculation. And so that's a big savings for the deal. In this example, you can see the breakdown there in the table. So the first question that we get under this structure, or really kind of in today's market, is can we keep those positive earnings? And so, you can see here the spread that Jack and I were just talking about. That navy blue is the tax exempt rate, the red being the treasury rate. So those are the investment earnings. But I'm a lawyer, and so my answer to that is it depends, right? So kind of depends on the structure, depends on who your bond counsel is, and kind of and, you know, having those conversations early as to whether or not you'll be able to keep the earnings. Under the short-term cash collateralized structure, the answer is generally no. There are opportunities if there is maybe a tax exempt seller note or potentially a B piece that you could blend those yields. Not very common, but there are certain structures that may allow you to keep those positive earnings. So we'll talk about those on future slides. So this is just an example of a short-term cash collateralized deal that some of us worked on in Texas, Sunset Gardens. So just you know, kind of a pretty picture to keep you guys awake, and some of the statistics on short-term cash collateralized deal. We'll go ahead and move into the next.
Was that actually new construction? I didn't work on that directly. Or was that a rehab?
That was a rehab.
Rehab.
Yeah.
All right, cash back forward. So this is, I really love the visual of thinking about the private placement as chocolate and the short-term cash back bonds as peanut butter. And this marries those into like a delicious Reese cup execution. So Cashback Forward actually was born in Texas. We created this structure several years ago, kind of based on the idea that there are no no drawdown bonds allowed in the state. And so this is marrying those two executions, which can allow some really generous savings and potentially keeping those positive earnings. So did you want to talk through, anybody have any feedback on this? All right, this looks like the movie Beautiful Mind. Don't be intimidated by the by the roadmap here. Again, we do have animated slides, which makes this a little more clear. But the idea here is similar to the short-term cash collateralized deal. The bonds are going to be sold publicly through an underwriter, fully funded with the trustee on day one. You're going to have a separate third-party construction lender who's going to come in and essentially fund to the trust estate, like we talked about before, collateralizing the bonds. Bonds are going to be, bond proceeds are going to be spent on the project. And that's going to flow through until you get to conversion, where you're going to have the equity and perm lender come in. Their goal is to hold the bonds. And so this could be a private placement. This could be a TEL. There are a few different flavors on the back end, but they'll come in, essentially fund into the, pay off the construction lender. That perm lender is then going to move into the senior lien position. The trustee, remember, is holding all of this cash. So they're going to use that cash to pay off the initial bond holders, and that bond is going to flow through, be tendered, and transferred over to the permanent lender. So again, it sounds really complicated. If you want to see the beautiful animation, it's really very helpful to see what all of these, hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents that Levi and I are drafting actually do. So, but again, a lot of benefits to this transaction. So the idea kind of behind, and this is a bit of a 102 concept, but the idea behind being able to capture those positive earnings for the benefit of the deal is based in the idea of blending yields. And so under a short-term cash collateralized deal, you're having to run a rebate analysis to determine anything above the bond rate has to be rebated back to the IRS. But under this scenario where you have a longer term bond, that rebate calculation can be pushed out to 5 years, which is the longest term for a rebate. So you're able to kind of average out, sort of blend out that short-term period with that long-term bond. And you can see here that those investment earnings are above the bond yield. And so that would allow you to potentially keep those earnings for the benefit of the deal. Yeah, so this is just kind of showing a comparison of a private placement versus this cashback forward structure. So even with the additional costs, you're going to have a potential savings on this $30 million example of over $1 million. So, when you have developers that are coming to you and asking questions, we keep a pretty extensive database on every deal that we close. Folks come to us and ask, what soft funds are available? Where can I find, some additional funds to make my deal work? And when you're looking at scenarios of, trying to get a grant for $200,000 or $100,000, like that's such a drop in the bucket on these really big deals. And so a shift in the execution can really, gain the ground that you're looking for versus kind of pulling these crumbs together to cobble your deal. Again, this is the idea of that 266 election. So you're here looking at the cashback forward scenario on the right. So just able to boost your equity base off of keeping that bond interest and construction interest in your basis calculation. Yeah, again, just in full disclosure, there are additional fees. You do have this publicly offered piece. So you're going to have an underwriter, underwriter's counsel, which is my role, rating agency, verification costs, that type of thing. But even with those additional costs, the net is a big benefit to this execution. Just some other data on some of the benefits. This is specifically a home run in Texas, as I mentioned, because of the no drawdown bond rule. So whereas it was created in Texas, it's now based on today's market a huge success, as Jack was mentioning, something that we're using across the country. Fannie and Freddie are really neck and neck, but the benefits for this cashback forward structure, especially on a new construction deal or a deal with substantial rehab, it's a winner. All right, the MTEB. You want to kind of give a little bit of an overview on that?
Yeah. So so this is the we've gone over private placement, we've gone over Freddie Mac, which is the short-term cashback structure. And then private placement, and then the fourth lender would be Fannie Mae. And so primarily their main vehicle in the tax exempt space is the MTEB, which I'm blanking on what that actually stands for, but it's something municipal. But essentially the MTEB is it's a long-term bond structure. So you basically in Texas you have the drawdown bonds day one, but this across the country, Fannie Mae MTEBs need to be drawn down at closing. So in the new construction context, the implications for that is that basically you're generating negative arbitrage because you're paying a higher interest rate on the long-term bonds. Like I think I looked at the math and it was like 505, 510 on the long-term Fannie bonds during the construction period, and then you're reinvesting at 313. So that's generating a massive amount of negative arbitrage. And the reason for that is, Freddie Mac warehouses, they can lock the rate on the forward commitment because they basically warehouse the interest rate hedge in the loan, during the construction period, whereas Fannie Mae doesn't. So they don't balance sheet the loan during the forward period. So in order to lock the rate, you basically have to draw down the long-term bonds at closing, and that sits in the cash collateralized account. And prior to, the period of time we're in now, 18, 24 months ago, that negative arbitrage was next to nothing. And now that's even gotten wider and wider. And so that's made Fannie less competitive in the new construction space. That concept doesn't exist in rehab. So I think that's a lot more even of a playing field. What else were we?
Yeah, and as we talked about, the MTEB is going to be based off that MMD rate, whereas private placement is off of the taxable rate. So just something to consider and kind of compare as you're running your side-by-side analysis.
Exactly. And that's what we do. And so, Fannie is the tightest rate. Like they do have the lowest rate in both new construction and rehab because of that. Like that's their key advantage, the MMD being indexed. Actually, the only lender in the space that actually indexes off of a tax exempt index. The rest do taxable. So that's what we do for clients. We basically put the loans side by side, the 4 structures I talked about. We say, okay, this is, these are your rates, but the rate's kind of a more simplistic way of looking at it. You have to look at like, what is the net benefit to the project and what, what yields the highest proceeds. And I think as we move forward in time, Fannie's become less competitive just because of that growth in negative arbitrage. It's like, I would say today, the Freddie, in a new construction context, the Freddie Mac cashback structure is by far and away the most accretive. So.
And as far as timing is concerned, sometimes folks want to rate lock early given the uncertainty. And so you might be able to do that with the cashback forward structure, be able to lock that in earlier. MTEB is going to be locked in at the time of pricing the bonds.
Yeah,
so
maybe, 5 days.
Yeah.
So I think in a time of interest rate volatility, that's one of Freddie Mac's key advantages, the index lock.
Yeah.
And I would say also the last thing, when I talked about how Fannie is readjusting their credit after winning the lion's share of bond business, is they pulled back on amortization, right? So they basically, in order to rebalance their portfolio, they basically had to they were being more choosy on who they were offering 40-year amortization, and the difference between 30 and 35 and 40 is massive. So we had there was a period of time where that Fannie was not giving 40-year amortization to even select sponsors or managed borrowers, right? Which they're largest accounts. So that's something that's changed. I think it's going back to more, 40 now, but.
And I would say kind of when you're looking at that side by side with a Fannie, there is kind of this visual, like a little bit of sticker shock, maybe. There's a lot more upfront costs that go along with an MTEB, but when you dig into it, comparing the proceeds against the other executions, that's a big consideration as well.
For sure. And when they had a 65 or 70 basis point advantage to every other lender in the market like that, they were by far and away the most competitive. But as the rates, have tightened, obviously, it's become more challenging for them.
We're all experts now in cash collateralized bond structures. So the Fannie MTEB is really going to look very similar to that cashback forward structure that we just went through. So again, publicly offered bonds being sold on the front end. The difference here, as Jack mentioned, these are long-term bonds, whereas the cashback forward has this initial bond holder for a short period until conversion. The MTEB, these initial bond holders are going to be in for the long haul. So again, fully funded on day one, all of that cash sitting with the trustee. That you're going to have a third. This is on a forward MTEB, so you have the third-party construction lender coming in, funding that cash collateral into the trust estate, releasing bond proceeds to be spent on the project. And then the difference here at conversion, you're going to have the perm lender and equity come in, pay off that construction lender and move into that senior lien position. But the borrower is then going to make its debt service payments to the perm lender, who is going to strip off service and guarantee fees and then pass that through to the trustee, who then makes the payment to the bondholder. And so they're going to stay in place for the long haul. Want to talk to any of this?
I feel like we covered most of that. I probably got to hit myself a little bit.
Yeah, so it's going to have a lot of the similar benefits to the cashback forward structure. So again, yield blending, so potentially capturing those positive earnings for the benefit of the deal, additional equity when you're taking that 266 election. We've talked about loan proceeds being at a higher amount in most circumstances. And then
no, I would say one thing, not to interrupt, but number 4 is something we haven't really harped on, is that in the Fannie structure, like that's one of their key advantages, is that you basically have you're paying a higher interest rate on the long-term bonds. That yields more equity than the cashback structure, and then you're also capitalizing the taxable construction loan interest, right, as well.
Yeah.
So that's something that when Cricket like runs her full model, and like this is something we can't possibly look at how that math looks like for our client, but it's I think that especially prior to rates coming in closer together, that was a key advantage of the MTEB too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something, we've talked about being organized and having like this ongoing conversation with the deal team, talking to your equity provider about those types of benefits coming in could change your equity pricing as well. So making sure that, any earnings that are coming into the partnership is something that you're having, it could affect your pricing on equity, may not, but just making sure that you're having an honest conversation. It's not a surprise for anyone.
Absolutely. And making sure that gets priced on the front end so that it's not a surprise coming into closing. And I think we'll see that on the case study as well.
Yeah, and just kind of right now, construction loan rates are pretty high. So in these cash collateralized structures, if you have other funds that are coming in that may be a grant or, some other sort of lower cost dollars that are coming in at closing, you could use those as a source of collateral and sort of delay that construction loan coming in. So that could create on these larger deals significant savings on kind of delaying that interest carry on your construction loan. We had also talked, one of the rules that Levi covered earlier was that program investment test. So all of these cash collateralized structures with publicly offered bonds, those bonds are being sold to investors out in the marketplace. And so you're not running afoul of that program investment test, which may trigger an issuer fee challenge for the project. Again, all of these slides are going to look pretty similar, but just showing the numbers, I think is really helpful. Obviously, the slides are going to be available. This is probably pretty small font for those in the back, but just showing the significant savings under the MTEB based on yield blending and some of the other 266 election. Yeah, just again, under the 266 election, we're looking at around $900,000 in savings. Additional costs, obviously, as we mentioned, with the publicly offered piece, it's not cheap, around $300,000. But at the end of the day, we're looking at about $1 million in savings going with this structure. Cedar Ridge.
Perfect. So just applying basically everything we've talked about into a real life example. Cedar Ridge is a deal Lincoln Avenue closed about 11 months ago. And I think this is a really great example of the forward MTAB basically making a deal feasible. This was really sort of the case of this deal was going to close or it wasn't, and basically generated an additional $1 million of equity that got the deal closed. So I think, and I think this one's also in San Antonio. Worth noting, this one was also a sister deal with a family deal. So delivered effectively over 550 units combined, but focusing on the senior deal for this case study. So basically running through this breakdown of the additional costs. So basically you're taking the bond sale proceeds and reinvesting them. We've been through that. In doing that, you are no longer expensing your bond costs, but you're capitalizing them, which is what generates this additional equity. So you're increasing your basis as we sort of insinuated. And that's in this case adding $1.5 million in additional equity proceeds. This deal was also in a QCT, so you're getting that additional 30% boost advantage. Again, increasing your total development cost, you're increasing your developer fee. And then this additional loan proceeds is just a factor, that $254,000 is just a factor of the rate advantage at that time. I think this one's actually really interesting because you'll see the series bond positive earnings of $159,000 was the longer term, but the negative arbitrage that you see is actually the Series A, those shorter term, and actually it was a negative earnings for the project. But even still, just with the additional basis generated, it's still a net benefit to the project as a whole. And I think obviously the additional bond costs that Allison ran through, attorney's fees, accountants fees, underwriter fees, all of that. The equity pricing, so this was effectively equal to 1 penny On this deal, we didn't end up approaching this deal as a forward MTAB from the start. And so that was a 1 cent penny hit from our equity provider that we did have to factor in. I think one thing also worth noting, again, I feel like a broken record here, but thinking about these structures early, communicating with your entire team, these additional transaction costs also increase your total development costs. So you're going to need more bonds. And so hopefully you've applied for a bond allocation that allows you some cushion to account for this, but really much better if you can think about it on the front end and make sure that you're not coming close to your 50% test through changing a structure after you've already applied.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that's a really great point. As kind of going back to the rules and the 50% test, and during COVID, we had a lot of deals that ran afoul of that 50% test, running into cost overruns and delays and that type of thing. And Texas doesn't really have a clear path for going to get additional volume cap.
Right. I mean, once you make that application for your amount, that's your set amount.
Yeah.
In the program, and unless you go back and you might need to be reinduced by the issuer for an additional amount, and then you have to make a new application. So there's ways around it, but they're slow.
Yeah. And it's super expensive, right? I mean, bonds kind of have these flat costs of Levi's fee and my fee are priceless, but obviously there are, some expenses that go along with it. And so that's a set fee. It's the same amount of work for us to do a $1 million bond versus a $30 million bond deal. So, ratings, all of that have to come into play. So definitely something to consider. One of the questions that came in, kind of just a general question for cashback structures, is the risk of the interest rate environment and ways to hedge that risk. So I think that kind of goes to the idea of pricing the bonds, locking in your rate on your taxable loan or whatever execution, but then also the investments. And I think making sure that we kind of understand, like, you're locking that investment rate at the time of pricing the bonds. So you don't have the risk of those investments changing over the life of the bonds. And I think that's how we're able to, I know that is how we are able to get our AAA rating and maintain it, is the rating agency has to ensure that cash is going to be in place and held at a rate that's high enough to cover the cost of the bonds. Yeah. So
I
sorry,
think
go
too,
ahead.
just kind of picking the correct structure. I mean, we've gone through the last 30 slides showing different kind of structures and the advantages of those. So I mean, just understanding new construction versus acquisition, what your options are, and having those conversations early, like Cricket said, with your group and with your potential lender, and just understanding what your options are can help mitigate that, just because you're picking the right path early.
Yeah.
And there is always going to be interest rate risk. I mean, the markets change daily. So it's going to be hard to mitigate down to zero, but understanding how you're doing this earlier and going down that path as soon as you can will help with that risk.
Yeah. And so that's interest rate risk before you've locked in the execution. Right. But then once you're at closing, those rates are all locked in. And all right, let's see. It was mentioned that even after the 50% test has been reduced to 25%, there still may be projects that are restricted at 51. So what kind of projects are those? And can you provide some clarification?
Sure. So those would be projects where on the bond review board application, there's a section that's called the residential rental attachment. And on that page is where one can indicate whether the application qualifies for a higher priority, which means essentially that you would get a reservation sooner. Those priorities are, for the most part, tied to affordability levels. So it's projects with deeper affordability that are going to qualify for either priority 1 or priority 2 application. And I cannot tell you off the top of my head exactly what those affordability categories are. But if you want to follow up with me afterwards, I can show you where you can find that information. But essentially, projects with deeper affordability can elect a higher priority. But the trade-off there is this 51% test. Also, and I always caution developers about this when they indicate that they want to do an application with a higher priority, is that you could end up, especially if you're priority 1, you could end up getting a reservation the first week of January. And that means that you need to be ready to go. And in particular, you have to have your tax credit application done at that point. And so it's we always see it where we have a project that has a priority one, and notwithstanding that we've cautioned about it, first week of January comes, project gets a reservation, tax credit application isn't ready to go, and at that point there's nothing but to do but withdraw and reapply. And so you need to be careful about that. And then there's the new priority zero, which we've just had here for the last couple of years. And that is for projects where you have a project that has previously issued bonds, is having an issue meeting the 50% test, though we'll see if that even is relevant anymore now in the 25% test world. But if you have a project that has a 50% test it has to comply with, and it's not going to get there, so they need to issue additional bonds. This is a way that you can sort of jump to the front of the line to get that additional volume cap to do that supplemental issuance. And so those are priority 0, 1, and 2. And those are the projects that are subject to this 51% requirement.
Unfortunately, it just takes Texas statute a couple years to catch up with federal at this point, because we've just finished our ledge session. There's still a little ambiguity on how this is going to work out. So I mean, the 25% kind of rule that kind of came up, a couple weeks ago. So we're still trying to figure out how it's going to work in Texas and how to move forward and how to, fix that in the next legislative session.
Mm-hmm. But it will still probably be helpful to some projects that are subject, because projects that have closed within the last several years are still subject to the 50% test. And so as they're nearing completion and realizing that they may need some additional bonds, we can still go in and get those so that they will be able to comply.
One quick thing I'd like to just mention, under this cash collateralized structure, as the bonds are sitting with the trustee and invested, those bond earnings, investment earnings, can go into your calculation of your numerator on your 50% test. And so this is a really interesting sort of trick that a lot of people don't know. It doesn't require volume cap. So it's essentially kind of free volume cap without having to get volume cap. So it's, if you're running really close on your 50% test, this is something that you may want to run through with your bond counsel and tax counsel, kind of this calculation, but it may save your deal if you're kind of hanging by a thread. We've already talked about just, again, if there are other sources that are coming into the deal, sort of delaying that more expensive construction loan. And then, again, we've also talked about this program investment test. So that's really it for us today, and welcome any questions that folks may have. Otherwise, feel free to submit them through the app. And we have a couple more technical questions that are in the app, but we'll probably answer those directly through the app in response. So you would just help me thank the panelists for participating today.